So let's do it. Hey there. Yeah, yeah. Hey there. Thanks for being with us as we kick off Drupal GovCon 2021 this morning with the future of the US web design system. Uh, I'm Dan Williams. I'm the USWDS project lead, and it is now 8 a.m. here in Portland, Oregon. Um, I have some morning coffee. I do, and I'm ready to get started.
Everyone, I'm James Mejia, and I'm a developer on the USWDS core team. And it's 10 a.m. here in gloomy Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm happy to be here to talk with you all this morning about USWDS.
All right, let's do this. So, before we look into the future, a little bit of a look back. Uh, we released USWDS 1.0 about 4.5 years ago, maybe a little bit more now, in February of 2017, about 10 internet years ago, and about 2 government years ago. This was our first pass at like a style guide for government. And at the time, it was something fairly new in government, a collection of tools and best practices for building websites. And right from the beginning, we were able to do something of what we still hope to do with the design system, to help teams focus their time on high value problems by providing a toolkit of ready to use website building blocks. And these are like building blocks like buttons and form fields and headers and footers and things like that. Um, But, while this release, USWDS 1, was a great starting point, it had a few issues. It was really opinionated, and it had a lot of greedy styles. Thus, it was hard to add USWDS 1 to an existing site without a lot of unexpected effects, and it made incremental adoption quite challenging. If you remember ever trying to do this back in the USWDS 1 era, it was quite likely that if you added the design system code to your site, like all of a sudden, like the text would get super big or super small, and like all of everything would be all screwy, and it was hard to add it without it doing a lot of unexpected stuff. And it also lacked an explicit design language that connected its components. Once you started customizing the design system, it was hard to tell just what made a design system site at all. You either kind of used its default styles or you went off on your own. Um, and once you went off on your own, you were on your own. The design system didn't have any way to guide teams when they made necessary customizations. So we built USWDS 2.0 to address these concerns. This is back in April of 2019. We released that at DrupalCon in Seattle in 2019. And when we released Design System 2, we wanted a design system that was a lot easier to add incrementally, and one that's built to sort of adapt to project needs while still speaking a common design language. This is why we pretty much totally rebuilt the way we wrote our style sheets and markup. This is why we introduced a broad range of expressive design tokens and utility classes. This is why we developed customizable project settings. As we said at the time, USWDS 2.0 was built to grow, and it has grown. Since launching USWDS 2.0, we've added 25 components and 6 templates. We more than doubled both our components and templates since launching. We're now used by almost 400 websites with over 250 million sessions on USWDS powered sites per month. By many metrics, USWDS 2.0 and subsequent releases in the 2 line have been a successful release. And we've improved it over the last 2.5 years over a series of releases that bring this line up to 2.12.1. But, and there's always a but, it wasn't all good news coming out of USWDS 2.0. We made so many changes moving from 1.0 to 2.0 that migrating between versions was a real like PETA or like a pain in the pain in the neck. Um, so while USWDS 2.0 offered significant improvements over 1.0, we couldn't realistically suggest migration for many projects. Breaking changes can require a lot of time and technical know-how to manage. You do have to think about resources and cost benefit analysis. The return on investment can be too low to justify. Like the design system was supposed to make things easier, right? So, we managed to prove it to ourselves. Fact, migrations suck. And breaking changes will always give teams pause and require project specific justification. Is this worth our time? So, as we move forward with the 2.0 line, we tried to break things as little as possible. Promote continuity is one of our design principles, and it's one we take to heart. However, and there's always a however, when we're concerned about not breaking things, this can also make it difficult to change and evolve. This puts the design system in a bit of a double bind. When it's easier to grow than change, it reduces your maneuverability over time. This increases the cost of change and can lead to painting yourself into a pretty serious corner. So, paradoxically, this highly risk averse model gradually increases the necessity of change over time. And this buildup of pressure can result in large, disruptive, and risky big bang changes instead of ongoing incremental improvements. Put simply, risk aversion doesn't always reduce risk, it sometimes just delays it. We know that the design system has to change over time. As the world of development and design changes and teams' needs change, the design system needs to evolve as well. The design system has to improve and scale those improvements to the teams that use it. Today, we see a couple of necessary changes and improvements on the horizon that we'd like to address sooner rather than later.
Right, Dan. And first is ending support for IE11. IE11 will go out of support for certain operating systems starting June 15th, 2022. IE11 usage has consistently been below our 2% support threshold, according to analytics.usa.gov, since May. And there's every indication that this trend will continue. It's in the best interest of the design system and the teams that use it to officially end our support for this browser. Second is support for modern Sass syntax. Sass is our style sheet language, and its syntax has had some major changes back in 2019. There's a new syntax called the Sass module syntax system, or Sass modules, and as of next month, October 2021, the Sass project will deprecate the old @import syntax and drop legacy support altogether by October 2022. If you've been compiling USWDS style sheets recently, you've probably started to notice some deprecation warnings. The new syntax will not only get rid of these warnings, but allow us to deliver smaller, more performant, and better customized style sheets. Support for Sass modules has developed a bit slowly and inconsistently over the last couple of years, but today there are practical compiling solutions for every kind of project. And again, it's in the best interest of the design system and the teams that use it to update to the modern syntax as we start moving forward. The design system needs to make these changes and clearly signpost them. That is, we need to be very clear that before a certain point, we did things one way, and then after that point, we'll be doing things another way. If you need IE11 support or legacy Sass syntax, you need to stay behind a certain obvious version. At a clear signpost version and beyond, the rules have changed. Now, there's another concept that needs similar signposting, and that's related to how we use JavaScript in the design system. Since the beginning, USWDS has taken a little bit of a wait-and-see approach with JavaScript. We've attempted to design our components so they work without JavaScript, or they work as JavaScript-powered progressive enhancements on native HTML elements. This can improve resiliency and performance, but not necessarily. While data on JavaScript-disabled browsers is unfortunately light, as of 2010, 11 years ago already, sessions with JavaScript disabled counted for about 2% of website traffic in the US. And as of 2016, it was at 0.2% in the UK. As of 2012, JavaScript disabled screen reader traffic was at 1.2%, of all screen reader traffic. Even 10 years ago, this number was close to our 2% support threshold, and we don't believe that increasing the reliance of the modern web on JavaScript has moved this number up. WCAG 1.0 from 1999 required that pages be functional and accessible with scripting disabled. But WCAG 2.0 and all other modern guidelines allow you to require JavaScript. Well, we've waited and seen, and it's time for us to drop the must work without JavaScript requirement as no longer relevant and practical to the modern web. We need to do more to support JavaScript development with USWDS and to make USWDS components more compatible with modern frameworks and ways of working. So together, these three necessary changes, dropping IE11 support, enabling modern SaaS, and requiring JavaScript for some functionality, provide new rules for how we can build the design system and how you can build with it. So when I talk about a clear signpost version, is this USWDS 3.0? The short answer is yes. But before we really talk about what USWDS 3.0 means, it's worth asking, what does a version number even mean? One thing to note is that version numbers aren't just a marketing gimmick. Real version numbers aren't like Web 2.0, a cool sounding number we kind of pull out of thin air. Version numbers should mean something. In fact, version numbers should have a very explicit meaning. As you might have guessed, what I'm talking about here is semantic versioning, using major, minor, and patch versions to tell developers what to expect from a release. In a nutshell, major versions make breaking changes, minor versions add features, and patch versions fix bugs.
Now, here's where it gets kind of funky for a project like USWDS. If a major version is a breaking change, or like according to SemVer documentation, like making incompatible API changes, well, what the heck is the API for USWDS? Is it a major version change when we update a class name? When we change the markup of a component? When we change its interaction, its style or display? When we change its interaction style or display like a lot? What does that even mean? Is USWDS guidance subject to semantic versioning as well? These are good questions. These are great questions even. And depending on how we interpret the USWDS API, the design system right now, it might realistically be on version 21.2.1 instead of 2.12.1. Would it freak you out to see design system version 21? Maybe. But, practically and realistically, this ambiguity about how we implement semantic versioning, and even if we do, makes it harder for developers and designers, program managers, anyone really, to know what we've changed and what its impact will be on their projects. And this ambiguity reduces trust. Teams need to know what's changed, and we need to use more accurate semantic versioning to communicate when it's like safe to move from one version to another, and when moving from version to version might require additional time, energy, or other resources. Without good knowledge, teams can't make good decisions. And an additional complication is one we might call the bundle problem or the battleship, like the big gray battleship we see on this slide, courtesy of the Library of Congress. In the battleship problem, we can think of the code base as a battleship, like a complex monolith where every element, in our case, every component, is bundled together in a single package, connected, tightly coupled, codependent. Every part of the battleship moves and turns at the same time. And let's look at a little bit of how this works. So at the left, we see a schematic simplification of code base with just like 6 components. In our example, the code base is at version 1. So as we develop the code, we move to the middle diagram, and we see we've made some changes. A couple of components, the blue ones, got patches. One component got a minor change, that gold one, and one got a major change, the orange one. Maybe we needed to change its markup. And the diagram on the right shows the final release. Since the change we made was we did make a major change in there, like the whole release is a major release, moving the project from 1.0 to theoretically 2.0. So given a collection of changes to components, even if components evolve at different speeds, they all can release in the same version when they're bundled together like this. And unfortunately, this means that specific component patches or bug fixes can be dependent on unrelated major or minor updates elsewhere in the code base. This means that Battleship code bases can block patches and features with major changes. Major changes in any individual component can prevent teams from adopting patches in unrelated components and can block subsequent patches as well. As we saw in the previous slide, a major version release might include some patches, some minor changes, and at least one major change. Teams might want the patch changes. Teams that want that patch change could be unwilling to upgrade since they risk introducing a breaking change at the same time. For example, imagine a developer looking at updating to a potential design system version and thinking, I want to get this accessibility improvement to Combo Box or this JavaScript improvement to Modal, but I don't want to have to break our header to get it. And not only are the patches in that specific release blocked, but any subsequent patch or minor update to that component will be blocked as well. So, why not just avoid making major changes to just do a better planning? Well, battleships tend to inhibit necessary changes. Uh, since we want to reduce major breaking changes, we may put off necessary major change in favor of other work. But that major need does not go away. On this slide, that major need is shown with that dotted orange line. While we continue to make patch changes, the blue changes, and minor changes, the gold changes in other components, development on one component stalls because it would introduce a breaking change in the component and thus in the entire code base. Depending on the risk aversion model, this change could sit uncompleted for some time. And this doesn't really work in the service of incremental development. The Battleship not only can make patch versions dependent on unrelated major or minor versions, but the flip side is also true. It can prevent necessary major or minor changes because of guaranteed downstream development cost, even for teams that don't want, need, or are able to implement that specific change. Thus, the Battleship turns slowly and poorly. Right now, a USWDS sort of functionally operates as a battleship, but it should not be one, and it can't effectively operate as one as we move forward. So instead of a battleship, it can be more useful to see USWDS as a collection of more loosely related individual projects, the components themselves. This model is less of a battleship and more of a flock of birds, like this murmuration of starlings we see on the slide here. In fact, we introduced the concept of USWDS components as individual packages in USWDS 2.1 in a kind of undeveloped way, I would say. But now it's time to bring this idea of components as packages to the next level of maturity. In the flock model, the component becomes the unit, the fundamental unit of the design system. And each USWDS component is its own official NPM package with its own semantic version history and its own dependencies. Now, there could, and there definitely would, still be an omnibus package like the current USWDS package. But that package would simply include all the relevant component packages as dependencies and contain little unique code of its own. So where a battleship bundles components as a single package, in the flock model, each component is a package. And the flock is configurable. The flock model decouples individual components and allows developers to choose which parts of the design system they need in their projects and which components they have the time and resources to keep up to date from sprint to sprint and increment to increment. As we move from left to right in these diagrams, we see that each component is a package over there on the left. In the center, each package has its own version history, Each is moving forward by patch changes or minor changes or major changes. And on the right, we could see what might be a project-specific subset of design system packages. Teams include and update only what they need. As the design system moves forward, like we're only going to be essentially adding more features and more components. And it's essentially guaranteed that we're going to be adding more components and more features that any individual project needs on that project. So the ability to subset the code and to deal only with what you need on your own project is going to get that need is going to get greater and greater. So this idea of releasing component packages allows the design system to be very clear about how components have changed over time and to use more accurate semantic versioning for everything that we publish. Each component will have its own clear history, and we can track each package and its dependencies with NPM. On this slide, we see individual timelines for each of those components that we saw in the subset of the earlier slide. You can see as we move from left to right, as each component matures, each component gets patch releases, minor releases, and major version increments. Now, individual component packages allow teams to either update packages immediately and stay at the most current version, as we see in these timelines, with the project's active version also being the most current version in the timeline. But not every team has the same resources, the same project. Some may choose to implement major changes, but some may not and may wait to update until it's right for their project. Teams can update packages at their own pace, as we see in this slide, with the project's active versions at different stages in their timelines. The flock model can provide less overhead, less unused code, and better component tracking. And we expect to see projects moving from the Omnibus USWDS package to component-specific packages as we release them for just these reasons.
Exactly. As we move to this new model, we'll be reorganizing our code base into what you might call a component-centered architecture. Today, the USWDS codebase is organized by concern, broken up into 5 big buckets. We have styles, templates, JavaScript, data, and tests. This can be intimidating to contributors or people wanting to learn more about the codebase. I remember onboarding in late 2019 before many of the new components were introduced and being initially overwhelmed. It was a lot to take in. Contributing in the beginning felt intimidating because I didn't want to introduce bugs or cause unintended side effects. It was hard to understand the footprint of a component, the code that affects a component, and the code that a component affects. Component code was spread across the code base, as we see here with Banner. Banner styles are in one place, its markup and templates in another, JavaScript somewhere else. It can make it hard to keep track of everything, and it can make it hard to know just what makes up a USWDS component. So what if the component were front and center? Instead of organizing around the type of code we're writing, we can focus on the product we're delivering, in this case, USA Banner. In a component-centered architecture, the unit of organization is the component, and each component includes its own styles, templates, JavaScript, data, and unit tests. If you want to use or improve USA Banner, all of its code is in one place, along with the metadata to let us know its dependencies. And the same for other components, like the identifier or the button. And if we ever want to create a new component, it's easier to scaffold as well. It's more consistent and repeatable. Component-centered architecture makes our codebase easier to understand, easier to build and maintain, and easier to contribute as well.
So there's a new major version of the design system coming soon. That's going to be USWDS 3.0. And moving to this major version is going to be a whole lot easier than the move from 1.0 to 2.0, if you remember that. So this new version is going to do 4 very specific things. It's going to signal the end of IE11 support. It's going to update to modern SAS module syntax. It's going to allow requiring JavaScript, and it's going to publish semantically versioned component packages. And we don't want it to do too much else than that. That's like enough. So here's what the release is not going to do. It's not going to all of a sudden move straight to cutting edge CSS. It's not going to change the markup or the look and feel of the design system. It's not going to radically change our JavaScript. And it's not going to remove the familiar USWDS omnibus package. It's important to say that while this release signals the end of IE11 support, it doesn't mean that we're going to launch with a new grid-based layout grid or a bunch of CSS custom properties. We won't be changing our CSS much at all right now. Similarly, removing the must work without JavaScript requirement doesn't mean that we're going to launch with brand new JavaScript. We're not necessarily going to be changing the JavaScript much at all for 3.0. But as we'll discuss a little bit later, and even more over the course of the next few months, the 4 changes together, really suggest and support a number of potential improvements moving forward. So we plan to release this new major version, USWDS 3.0, in winter of 2022, with a beta program starting this month. As we learned from 2.0, we're going to be working hard to make sure that this update requires as little migration hassle as possible and points us in the direction of more joyful updating as we move forward. And, I'm serious when I mean that we intend to reduce this hassle to as close to 0 as we can. I think the biggest change here as we move into this new major version, from a developer's perspective, maybe the Sass modules work initially. But we think that most teams moving from about 2.12-ish to 3.0 will only need to update a couple lines of code and it will just work. It's just like minutes, seconds, hour of dev time to make this work. Our focus is on making it as easy as possible for everyone to know how the design system is changing and how those changes impact their project, and to stay up to date with improvements to the design system. And we're going to be trying to do something a little bit new with this release, not radically new, but a little bit new, which is that we're going to be trying to have our discussions around this release and the beta in the public forum of GitHub Discussions. We currently use issues and pull requests, obviously, as well as a public Slack channel that we use to discuss what we're doing and what's going on with our community. But for this release, we're going to be testing out GitHub Discussions some more. We hope it'll be the most public and practical place to discuss code, discuss what we're doing, get feedback, and interact with folks who use it. So, as we look into the future, we're looking to make the kinds of changes that we discussed here. USWDS 3.0 is sort of around the corner, but
That's right. Let's look a little further into the future, beyond USWDS 3.0, into the year 2000. And if you're familiar with the reference, I'm not going to even try to hit that high note. So
it's really far into the future.
Exactly. So we think that USWDS 3.0 is just the beginning of some important design changes. We know that there's a real gap between what USWDS provides and what developers implement in their projects.
So yeah, in fact, you could argue right now that USWDS doesn't really even provide components at all. We just provide pictures of components, like this Magritte pipe. It's not a pipe, it's a representation of a pipe. It's like a painting of a pipe. Similarly, in the design system, we deliver HTML versions of our components that you can copy and paste from our website, that you then have to reverse engineer in your own projects to make them work with your frameworks and your data. If you worked with the design system, I'm sure you've done this. Oh, how can I make the design system work in Twig? How can I make it work in React, in Angular? How do I wire a USWDS component into my Drupal project? Ceci n'est pas un component. You know, this like HTML blob that we have on our website, this is not really what developers need. Um, and as we've seen above with versioning, like this HTML blob is a giant pain in the neck. If we ever change something in the markup, like class name or the position of an element in complex component markup, or like literally anything about the markup at all, that can be a breaking downstream change. And and we don't want these breaking changes. We don't want updates to suck. And this way of delivering components, copy paste HTML, reverse engineer in your own project, and then uh, make changes depending on a GitHub diff going forward, pretty much ensures that updates always will suck. So we need to figure out how to do something different.
That's right. Instead of all that fragile code that needs maintenance with every update, wouldn't this be nicer? This is a web component, and this is what we're investigating as what comes after USWDS 3.0. And it gets us back to that component API we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and you know, like delivering in a canonical template form, whether web components or something else, like this demands that we explicitly develop a component API. You know, this is really important. It lets developers know, like, this is what a component can do. These are the settings and properties it accepts. And this is the type of content you can pass in it. And everything else, all those internals, kind of like all of that markup that makes it work, like that doesn't have to be your responsibility. Because I don't know, James, you've probably tried to integrate the design system into sites before. Like, how easy is it?
Definitely not easy at all in my experience, especially when going from 1.0 to 2.0. And I'm sure someone in the chat earlier had mentioned a similar upgrade from 1 to 2.
Yeah, 1 to 2 was just an enormous change, and you know I think it's been really hard to we want to make we want to make the design system easier to use, but we have like this very, I think, big and obvious gap like in between what we provide of sort of markup, styles, guidance, all this stuff. Like, and then what do we deliver? We deliver we don't deliver something that teams can use directly on their sites, and we pretty much assure that anytime we change something, anytime we make an improvement, we can't just say uh, just get the new version and press the button and you'll have it. It'll have to be like, hey, we made this change. It's you got to add this aria thing to this element, and then make this other thing over here and do this. And instead of making a change, we deliver like instructions for teams to implement that change on their own site, and that's really unsustainable. And need to kind of do better than that.
It's like the draw the owl meme, if y'all are familiar. But it's not just people upgrading from 1.0 to 2.0. I think there's people that have stuck to a certain version, an earlier version of 2.0, and they want to upgrade to the latest. I'm sure they've run into issues themselves too, as we remember from a few issues in GitHub.
Yeah, I think we're really, as we move forward in sort of like 3.0 and sort of beyond, like we're trying to set the stage for how the design system can change, how the design system can really evolve over time and continue to meet uh, user needs, developer needs, designer needs over time, make necessary change, but not make every time we have a necessary change a giant pain in the neck for developers. And I think that's a big, almost like existential problem for the design system that we are doing our best right now to begin to address. So we'll set the stage. We're kind of setting the stage for these changes in Design System 3. We'll use that platform to work forward into the future to hopefully make the design system just that much better moving forward. So we've reached we're at 35 minutes past the hour now. And I think that should leave us some time, uh, 10, 15 minutes or so to try to answer some questions. So
Yeah, we have some
what,
in the QA tab if you want me to go ahead and read the first one.
yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to see if I can stop sharing in a way that's not as little disruptive as possible. So apologies for seeing my screen for a sec.
Help you guys with the questions as well.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Jason.
Okay, so we have one. Is there a public roadmap for these changes?
So yes and no. There is a public roadmap, but it has not yet fully been updated with everything that we expect to do, sort of leading up to 3.0 and beyond. Like the roadmap essentially goes up to the project we've been working on over the last few months. A lot of those roadmap items that are on there are related to what we're doing as we work toward 3.0, but as we haven't yet officially updated it to those tasks that we're doing in support of 3.0 and those things that we're going to do beyond 3.0. But if you read between the lines in the existing roadmap, you will see some of what we're talking about here. That roadmap is on our website in the About section of our website. And
Yeah, and if you poke around on the repo, you can probably see the issues or the PRs popping up.
There's a question in the main chat that kind of will go along with the other two questions, and they're basically about components. How far out are you having USWDS web components componented, which I like that word, and do you need help? Are there commits or a repo you're working from?
So I would say we're sort of at the exploratory stage from in that web component work. We have been working on a web components version of the banner, and we've gotten that sort of, I think, into a workable state. As we move forward in the sort of transition into web component versions of our components, if in fact this sort of experiment proves fruitful, it's likely that we'll be sort of moving sort of incrementally with these components. Likely we won't drop web components versions of everything just all at once. We'll probably start with a couple and sort of move through the code base sort of one by one, or group by group. Likely starting with the banner, maybe with the identifier coming next. So, but that's still a little ways off. Right now, our focus is really on getting everything put together for 3.0 in the winter, and then moving from that foundation into that web components work. So I probably see even the first inkling of a web components version being at least a few months out from 3.0. That said, what I hope is that as we're moving forward into 3.0, and as soon as possible as we move on from 3.0, that we'll be able to start this discussion around a more with more directionality around web components, and starting with the banner. I think essentially that we'll start to release that work, and we'll start to really talk about like what the API for a component like the banner would have to be. I don't know if, James, do we have a branch right now where that work exists?
So we started prototyping with lit element, and we're going to start prototyping with Stencil.js. I don't believe we have the Stencil.js one up yet.
Yeah, we have been talking with some other teams around government who are doing the same sort of thing, building web components versions of in their own design systems. And we've been sharing some of what we've been doing and looking at some of what they've been doing, and starting from there. That's sort of what has gotten us a little bit down the stencil path right now, but we'll see where that leads us.
To build on lessons learned from other teams, so we can move faster and more efficiently.
Nice. I see that Smithsonian and NARA, note that Smithsonian and NARA are doing things with web components. And yeah, we've also been talking with SSA and IRS about this as well. So definitely it is an idea that I think this time is coming and is maturing rapidly. So how can we help? I think as we move, so there'll be a couple ways to help. Moving as we start moving into the USWDS 3.0 beta, there'll be a way to help just in, we'll be sort of fleshing out what we're sort of expecting in that beta program and what you can do to help with that in the next couple of weeks as we release the first of those Design System 3 betas. So look for a post in the GitHub Discussions around the 3.0 beta. Hopefully that'll be relatively light lift sort of things as we move forward with that, and we'll be using GitHub Discussions going forward as we work through some of these questions in web components. So I think we will be needing to seed some discussions around how teams have integrated these in their own projects, if they have any public documentation around how they've used web components, examples of sort of API documentation for what they've developed. All those things I think are going to be really useful to us. And feel free, James, to jump in over the top of me and throw in some other stuff if you got them.
Totally right. If any good resources you can share, they're more than welcome. We're still, like Dan said, in the exploratory phase. We want to make sure we're making the right decisions early on so we can go full speed once we have a strategy in place.
I want to get to some of the other questions in the Q&A channel. There is, just real quick, someone asked if there's an active Slack channel for USWDS, and I know there is one. So Dan, if you wouldn't mind like dropping that in the chat maybe.
Yeah. So if you go to, I believe it's chat.18f.gov, that's a link that sort of allows you to sign up for the USWDS public Slack. And that's one of the places where we'll be having these discussions. The other place that we're going to be starting, as I mentioned, that we'll be starting to do a little bit more of is at github.com/USWDS/USWDS/discussions. We're going to be starting to seed more discussions through that channel. And sort of as a follow-up, we sort of seeded a Drupal GovCon like follow-up GitHub discussion thread in discussions right now. So we'll talk about some things right now. As you have more questions, more things to chat through, we can use that thread to keep that conversation going. So you can do that there. We can start other discussions in that channel. You can also join the Slack and use the Slack as well. We know across the whole government, there's lots of people can access this, but not that but not this. So we're trying to approach things from a number of different channels to get the sort of broadest footprint.
There's a question there's two questions actually, and if you can kind of go through this. It's more of a general question really about design systems, I think. But it says if a hero component, and if there's a hero component and you update the button component, will the hero that uses the button reflect the update or reference the button update? I don't know if you want to, how you want to approach that, but that's kind of the essence of a design system, really.
Yeah. So that we would hope that that any complex component or any component that's built from other components would include those other sort of subcomponents by reference, and that component would say that this works with version X, post version X, or version X to Y of this other component. So yeah, if you had a hero and the hero had a button in it, the hero package would include the button package as a dependency, and it would manage it like that. So probably wouldn't include that button code like in hero, but it would include it as a dependency. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. There's also a similar question. I'll just read this just to see if we get a different answer. Once an atom, such as a button, is updated, does it update the organism that includes it, such as a main nav or a footer? Which is more or less the same question, I think.
So it should. Yeah, I think that's the intention, and that's the hope, that that you sort of that you maintain the relationships between between the components, between the atoms and the organisms in that model, and that everything sort of ties to the other one by reference. So when you update one, it updates the more complex one, or if you update the more complex one and it has another reference to one of its atomic component parts, then it should go in that direction as well.
Back to how can we make updates easier? How can we make updates not suck? And I think it's something we're actively working on through a variety of ways. One is just being more explicit about how this update affects you.
Okay.
And being really explicit in the let's just say the package JSON of to say that this version of, let's just say, USA Hero works with this version of button, or this or this version to this version of button. So any developer would really know, like, if you're using this version of Hero, it uses button, and it has to use button, version 1.0 and beyond, or or something like that. So maintaining that graph, that dependency graph, is really a part of what this would mean going forward.
Let's see. This is a really great question. What drives the new additions and feature improvements to USWDS components? Do the requests come from the implementation project teams? How do you user test the components?
Yeah, so it happens in different ways, but if we're talking about new features or components, are typically driven by requests or independent research. When we developed a number of new components last year, that came out of a lot of directed research that was around emergency response. So we had a big research project that went out and talked to lots of teams around what they're doing for emergency response, what their kinds of needs are in their own projects, and we looked at all of that, and we put together sort of a list of components that we would be working on to release in the service of that. And as we did that, and we did user testing as part of that development process. So as we were developing these components, I don't know if you were in the Slack or around the community at that time, like, you probably saw as things were coming out, that we were sort of releasing these things as drafts and putting them out for feedback and testing their usability internally as well. So we'll be going through that process. Changes a little bit from component to component, and we're always trying to see what the need is for future components and balance it against the roadmap and all of that. We also do our own sort of continual sort of user testing of some components, particularly if we start to hear that something is amiss. We did that recently with Link, as we were looking at our implementation of Link and like what we needed to do for whether or not we should be having a external link indicator at the end of external links. So we'll do our own testing around that, and we'll go from there. So we tend to have a hybrid of either our own research that results in new components to be added to the roadmap, or we're also, I think, very sensitive to feature requests and things that come in through the community, through GitHub, et cetera. And that's a good signal for us that we should be paying attention. Anything to add to that, James?
Got it. It's exactly that. We're not developing in a bubble. We're not going after what we think is cool or what might users need. I think we do a lot of research in the beginning to identify if there is a need at all, and then move forward from there.
Okay, we had a question about the public repo for the web componentized banner, and if you can post a link. I posted a link to the design system site and specifically the banner component, but is there something else you want to add to that?
Right now, we don't yet have I think a real public feature branch for Banner as a web component. But as we do that, we will post a link to it. Right now, as we're looking forward into this, we are right now working on sort of more of a mono repo model. So we probably will not have a specific additional repo for a web component version. We'll find those web component templates and that web component all the code for that sort of inside the Banner component within our existing repo. But we don't yet have anything to point to for it. It's really more of a, at this point, it's more of a preview than a real actionable ask right now, to let you know that it's coming up, and we'll be talking about it soon, but it's not yet there.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Yeah, I think you may be good. Well, thanks so much, James and Dan. I've used your design system. I know from experience that it's hard. It's really hard to develop a website with so many components and stuff. So thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for facilitating here. And I think part of what we learned from our research, and it's not going to come as a surprise to anyone, is like, it is hard, and all the things that are hard about it make it so there are fewer people than there could be who are using the design system and using it over time, and that is a very known and very critical issue to us. Moving forward and addressing that. The public Slack link, I think, is further up in the chat. It's at chat.18f.gov, and I think if you go there, you can, I think it's a Google form that will
Yeah, I was going to say,
register.
we want to keep the lines of communication open. So please sign up to Slack, check out the GitHub discussions, reach out.
Question about who does the Drupal adaptation of the design system, and someone posted a couple of links to that. I don't know if you have any insight into that. Dan, you're on mute, I think.
I don't remember exactly right now who is maintaining those.
I think that's independent.
Those
independent of your organization, right?
but it is independent of,
Right.
of the design system, and that's one of the challenges we've found, that because we don't support any sort of like canonical way of doing things, like everything rests on the community for doing implementations and sharing implementations. I posted the link to where we list implementations on our site, and hopefully that'd be a good resource.
Great. Any other questions? Just want to give everyone one more chance.
And I see the comment from Becca saying that web components are hard as well, and yeah, I think we are really going to. I think we are, as we move forward on this, we're going to lean pretty hard on the community to help us stress test this idea, and to figure out a good way to move forward on it. We may find that there is not the best way, but we will endeavor for a consensus building way of figuring this out, and try to do something that is as good as we can do.
Great. Okay. I don't. If there's no more questions, I think that's a wrap.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.